This is the ArtWorks Alliance podcast. ArtWorks Alliance promotes better participatory arts, encompassing all art forms, ways of working, settings, and art purposes. Find out more at artworksalliance.uk. Hello, it's Monday the 5th of August, and this is an ArtWorks Alliance podcast. I'm Rob Watson, and today I'm joined by Catherine Cartwright, Katie Smith, and Theresa Easton. And we're going to be discussing the trauma-informed community art practice. So what I'll do in a second is I'll get each to introduce themselves, give a little bit of background about what they do, how they've got into what they do. And then we're going to look at the topic, which is, I have to say, it's a topic I'm not massively familiar with. So it'll be really useful for me to learn about this essential topic at the moment, I think. Catherine, do you want to start off by telling us who you are, what you do, and a bit about you know, how you got into what you do?
Yeah, hello everyone. So I just submitted a PhD thesis on trauma-informed community arts practice, and I came to studying this through my own practice as a community artist over many years, realizing just how much I didn't know or was puzzled by when working in and with particular communities, particularly working with women who'd been affected by gender-based violence. And so, it's been an amazing opportunity to kind of delve deep into this area and find out more about how other artists work and practice, keep people safe and inspire them, and also to look at my own practice. So as part of the research, as well as interviewing artists about their work, I also ran a couple of art projects with women who are service users at Devon Rape Crisis and Sexual Abuse Services. So I think that's brief enough.
Very succinct. Katie, how about you?
Good morning, everyone. So I'm Katie, and I'm, I would describe myself perhaps as a retired social practice artist. So I worked in that area for 20 years, and my route into trauma-informed practice was working in increasingly challenging settings and just realising that to be an ethical practitioner, I needed to know more about trauma so that I wasn't kind of creating harm in those settings. So I decided to train as a psychotherapist. So I qualified 2 years ago. My original plan was to kind of merge my social practice with my therapy practice, so kind of do a bit of both. But through that, found actually being trained as a psychotherapist makes things even more tricky when you're working in trauma-informed work. So that's been an interesting journey. So I think that's me, and I'm really pleased to be here this morning.
Wonderful. Theresa, how about you?
Hi, everyone. So my background is also in community art, and I guess I started getting into doing work in communities probably 14 years ago, and it seemed to happen at the same time as a lot of austerity cuts started to come into play, and I found myself doing community art projects that were almost like filling gaps in other services, you know, so either working in Sure Start or working with arts development team and youth services. And I would often sort of do community art projects that aligned with my own art practice, which tends to be printmaking, artist books and zines. But more recently, similar to Katie in a way, I've moved away a little bit from community art, not just because there's less community art projects around, there's less money, but also because I've got a part-time job as an academic now. So I'm now looking at my practice that I've done over the last few years with a different sort of head on and a more kind of research perspective. So it is quite different.
Shall we start off by forming some definitions? I mean, the two obvious ones are, first of all, trauma and what trauma informed means, because it's relatively new in the lexicon of public engagement, social engagement type activities, and then also the community arts, social practice arts. That's a new way of terming it for me, which is useful. So Catherine, what's the kind of definition that you have established with your research, and how do you think that's come about within the wider community art, social arts practice sector?
Yeah, good question, Rob. So trauma informed as a term comes through kind of public health, as I understand it, and started emerging as a term around kind of the early 2000s, following a massive study that was done in the States around what are called adverse childhood experiences, where there was a lot of evidence that started emerging between long-term health complexities and what they call ACEs, or adverse childhood experiences that happened in childhood. So basically how kind of trauma affects like long-term health. So that was one of the things that was happening in terms of this growth in understanding about how trauma impacts both mental and physical health, that has kind of grown enormously over the last 20 years or so. So in lots of other sectors, like the police, like teaching, yoga and so on, you have this kind of prefix of trauma informed. And what it means is, I mean, the term isn't ideal for reasons that I won't go into here, but it basically means understanding what trauma is, how it affects people, how particularly it affects our ability to kind of self-regulate, which obviously, when we have difficulties with that, affects our behavior, our emotions, our ability to kind of stay present in the moment. So trauma itself is a kind of rather popular term, quite ubiquitous. It can be hard to define because it is used so much. But you might say there's different ways to understand it. But I think importantly, it's important to understand it both as something that has effects on individuals in terms of their physiology and mental health, but also that trauma is caused by kind of structural and political and cultural forces. So understanding trauma as big events that happen, that will happen to most of us, all of us, like bereavement, acute or chronic illness, things like that, but also trauma that occurs through racism, misogyny, poverty, which aren't these kind of big events like a bereavement, but are these accumulation of what they might call microaggressions throughout the course of a life that can create this scenario where someone's forever in this kind of, for example, in a kind of fight or flight state of regulation, like they're always on alert, they don't feel safe. So when you're managing your trauma, you basically, you don't feel safe in your body. And so in terms of being trauma informed, it's understanding at this what trauma is, how it affects people, and then how we as practitioners understand how we can help people feel safer, but also understand how it affects us, how our own lived experiences affect the way that we might behave or react in certain situations, so that therefore that's the I think at the crux of it is being able to kind of stay present and mindful and create time and a pause, so that as situations arise, you're more able to kind of respond with kind of pause and care all round. I'll stop there.
I mean, he raises a lot of questions, but what I want to do first is just check in with Theresa and Katie about how that aligns with your understanding of this. Theresa, let's start with you, and then how does that fit in terms of the general terms of reference, if you like?
Yeah, I think Catherine just summarizes that so well and eloquently. And I think if you speak to a lot of community artists, they wouldn't have that language because I've never had training in becoming a community artist. You kind of almost fall into it. You know, I come from a perspective of, I guess, wanting all communities and people around me to experience and enjoy a cultural activity. So I've kind of come in on a sort of cultural democracy angle, you know, and trying to sort of see how we make our own culture and have control and agency over that. And that often leads you into working with groups of people who have experienced trauma, but it's never actually spelled out to you by the commissioners. You know, so for one example, I remember working with a group in the northeast in Newcastle, a whole community. When I say community, like physically, people who lived in the area who'd experienced a community trauma whereby they'd just been shifted by the council into a completely different area, and their old council houses had all been knocked down. So you had lots of different people in different areas, and they had a massive sense of loss. And I remember doing the project. It was a short intervention, doing something creative and helping people just feel nice about themselves and have time for them to sort of talk, because there was people on hand for them to talk to. But at the end of it, there was nothing really for the freelancers, because we were part of these conversations. We were hearing them and listening to people's trauma, from the adults in particular. And then it was like, okay, off you go, bye-bye. So that last point that Catherine picked up on about what the freelancers do to look after themselves and take a pause and reflect is never something I've ever done until recently. And that's only because of need, you know, because that sense of feeling burnt out.
Katie, how about your experience?
Well, first of all, I think Catherine did an excellent summary of what trauma is and trauma-informed practice. I guess something that I would add, which is something that has kind of shown up in my work a lot, is it's something that Gabor Mate talks about in respect of trauma, and that it's not just the things that have happened to you, it's kind of the good stuff that you've missed out on. So when we think about that in terms of working with, I guess, you know, it quite often shows up in disadvantaged communities. Quite often, participants in a project haven't experienced secure attachment. So there's been a lot of the good stuff that they have missed out on in childhood. And then that really, really changes the relationships that you build within those projects, and you have to be so mindful. I think attachment is something that we perhaps don't factor in enough. I don't know what Catherine thinks about that, but you know, there are different attachment styles. So if you've grown up with you know, very stable home life where all your needs have been met, you've got a stable attachment style. But other attachment styles are anxious, avoidant, or disorganized. And that really, really changes the dynamics in a project. And I think that for me, that's been something, knowing and understanding how, you know, that good stuff that people miss out on shows up in relationships practice is really, really important, because a lot of stuff, is communicated through behaviour. And it's exactly what Theresa's saying. You don't go into a project with a commissioner saying, you're working with a community of traumatised people. Trauma just shows up. I think over the course of a year, everybody will experience some form of trauma. And, like Catherine is saying, that there's different things. There are the big things that happen to us, but then there's also an accumulation of smaller things. So I think, I think there's not an awful lot that prepares you as a community artist or a social practice artist to work with trauma. You have to kind of feel your way into it. And I think one of the big things as well is doing the work on yourself. So understanding for yourself, how has trauma affected you in your life? How is that then going to affect how you relate to other people or communicate with them? Or, how are the dynamics going to be different? What do you have to look out for? And I think there's a lot. I made a poster, I think about a year ago, and it says, listen with your eyes. And I think that's the thing that I've learned working, within trauma-informed practice, that you have to start listening with your eyes. So you have to kind of look at behaviours and interpret and understand what that behaviour is communicating to you, because sometimes that's communicating stuff that people can't actually articulate or verbalise. And that goes for quite often that shows up not just in the participants that you're working with, but with the commissioners. So that's a really interesting thing.
I'm a natural skeptic, so forgive me for the next couple of kind of framing questions. I always believe that you've got to unturn every stone to figure out what's going on. And the phrase trauma, I was writing down as Catherine was speaking, and just before you said this, is the difference between acute and chronic trauma. Is the danger with this, first of all, trauma as a traditional term for me kind of suggests that it is an incident, a specific single incident that is traumatic. That's probably most people's common sense definition. And forgive me if I'm not up to date with the kind of concepts with this. But the follow up from that then is that, does this then become a generalized term that actually loses its meaning because it's in the context of the UK, which is different from the context of the United States in many ways, is that this is kind of it's just kind of social life in the UK. People have been treated badly, generational poverty, class structures, that kind of thing. What is it with trauma that we're specifically saying that? Is it we're looking at people's emotion, we're suddenly turning the spotlight onto people's emotional well-being and saying working class stoicism or women's stoicism is not sufficient, that those unwritten rules, and that this is about moving the conversation forward into a different context?
I guess the point that I would make is that trauma, although trauma can be linked to a specific event, it's not the event itself that creates the trauma. It's the person's response to it. So, somebody could experience a horrific car crash, but have some form of inner resilience where they can process that experience and not be impacted by it. Whereas somebody else, it's their response to that event that creates the trauma. And then that kind of filters down into kind of smaller events as well. I'm not sure whether I'm explaining that well or not, but it's not the event itself, it's the person's response to it. Because, I guess I think the other thing is that, there's so much stuff on social media now where we have a medicalized language around our struggles. And so the term trauma can be really, really misused. So that there becomes a disconnect between what somebody's experiencing and what they've experienced. So yeah, I don't know whether I've answered that particularly well, but
no, you have. I was thinking, it draws to mind Schopenhauer, talks about, life is struggle. Buddhism sees life as it's difficulties, it's struggles, it's painful, and that's just the natural state of things. So it's putting that nuanced context, I think, is important about not just looking. I think we've lost Catherine, so I'm not sure. I've just sent her an email to see if she's able to, if she's dropped out, if we can get her back. But I think we'll carry on with the conversation because I don't want to break the flow of thought. And then try and get Catherine back in. I'll send her a text message as well in a second. So, Theresa, what that sense that kind of that trauma element to this is almost a pervasive term. What are the specifics that you look for in the context of, if you like, your art practice with people?
I guess because some of the work I've done over the past few years is also linked to social prescribing, art on prescription, which is, I guess, been around for a few years now. And it's exactly as Katie said, it has different bandwidths almost. Somebody could, I don't know if everyone's familiar with social prescribing, but it's a term that's been around for quite a few years, and it's not just sort of visual art related. It could be, you go to the doctors or you go to a local centre, Bernardo's centre, and there's somebody there who identifies a need in you and basically prescribes you to go off and do something like gardening or taking part in a walking group. And it's generally around your mental well-being and getting people out the house. These days, it's a bit of a buzzword, and it's a way that people have been able to tap in, I guess, to particular funding pots. And for me, it doesn't really address the whole problems within the sort of system, the sort of structural inequalities that we have. It just kind of skims the surface. But through this social prescribing, this art on prescription, there's people coming through who have very high support needs. And I don't always think that the artist is the best person to sort of deal with it, really. And it just goes back to the austerity cuts that we've had and the massive impact that's had on young people's mental health and well-being and youth provision. So I find it difficult to disconnect trauma with the sort of political choices that have been made over the years. Really, I do see it as an issue that has to be addressed through governments that are in power, through to local democracy. And I think it's a different approach that we need to have. We need to completely turn the whole thing upside down, really. In terms of the artists, I am also keen to look at how we as artists can also develop that resilience that Katie's talking about, because you're right, we can have these similar experiences and people do respond differently based on the other experiences. So as artists, just talking about this with each other and being open, even if it's a confidential thing, you can still talk about things without breaking confidentiality, and sharing this with other artists, I think, is so important, because you learn from other artists and you have that sense that you're not the only person experiencing this. And I think that's really important.
That prompted a thought for me, which was about the danger is that this over focuses on the individual and the individual's capacity to cope and manage with the stresses and traumas of life. And if your response is not adequate, but when we step back from it, we go, hang on a minute, I have a thing at the moment. Why am I putting on weight? Well, this is probably a trivial example, but it's like, why am I putting on weight? Hang on a minute. It's not my efforts to keep fit and healthy. It's the context within which the lack of available nutritional food, the lack of social settings, the level of stress in society, all that kind of stuff contributes to a chronic condition, which we absolve. Let's put it this way: that that power difference that we think about is, well, that system is set up and it's exploitative, and it's like, well, there's nothing we can do about it. It's just part of the free market, and people are free to choose what they do. But that puts so much responsibility on the individual to cope and manage themselves in those circumstances. And yet, when you suddenly realize it's not just me, it's also lots of other people in the neighborhood or the place where I live, they're struggling as well. There's a kind of that's that moment of realization. So there's a individual and a collective response to this. In terms of Katie, in terms of the creative response to this, what are the things that you were saying about your work as a therapist? And I'd be interested to know what strand or what school of therapy that you are trained in. Is how do you bring that that creative element as a response or a solution or an aid to these generalized or specific and individual forms of trauma?
That's a really good question. So I'm a pluralistic therapist, so I'm trained in several different approaches. So person-centered, CBT, and polyvagal informed therapy. So the project that I did after I qualified as a therapist was working with a group of women who had been in contact with the criminal justice system. And the whole piece of that work, because I think something that quite often is confusing about social arts practice is that it doesn't always need to end up in a, something that we would see as a piece of art, an actual tangible artifact or object. So that whole piece of work was just about working together as a group, and the group involved, me as the artist, the participants, but also their support workers. And it looked at how we could form, it started off as an agreement, but it built into a manifesto. And it was looking basically how we could work in a way where we acknowledged how power was operating. We looked at how we all had different responsibilities within that group. We looked at how to flatten the hierarchy of power. So it was more about supporting each other. So it wasn't about me going in as the artist and being the expert with all of the answers. It was me going in, I guess, as an artist, but also, the crossover with my therapy practice. It was about being curious and just, asking the questions. What's going on here? How can we develop a way of working that is just going to be kind of more caring and gentle and respectful of each other? So, what we ended up with was a manifesto, but then kind of post-project, it became really apparent that even if you've done all of that work, if it doesn't fit into the structure of the organisation that you're working within, it kind of, it doesn't really go any further than that, because you're constantly pushing and fighting against these structures that are already in place, and they're kind of multi-layered. You've got the organisation that I was working for. You have to think about where they were drawing their funding from and what the kind of targets were that they had to hit. And this was a really tricky one because, these were criminal justice involved women. So the funding that the organisation were drawing down was from the Ministry of Justice, and it was all, all of the outcomes that they wanted for the women was to develop pro-social behaviour. But if you look at your work as an artist and it's all about challenge and taking risk and asking questions, then we, created this amazing manifesto that did all of that. But then it makes that particular group really dangerous within the organisation and the wider structure, because it's not ticking those boxes. You know, it can be seen as this is promoting not antisocial behaviour, but it's not encouraging people to kind of fit into a box.
Well, you answered it. You kind of started on a path to ask a question which had come to my mind, which is about safeguarding, because there's one of the dangers with this is that organizations, well-meaning organizations, can do. You're trained as a therapist, Katie. We can be. If I did this, I would be very, very careful about going down the route of working with people's trauma, because I'm not a therapist. I'm not qualified for that. But a lot of well-meaning people in organizations latch onto this because the funding comes through with this. And what you're actually doing is re-traumatizing the people who are involved in this each time. It's not their consent to say, actually, we want to do something completely different outside of this, which isn't, as you say, about risk taking or meets the objectives of the funding call or the body, because that's the trendy notion that they want to. It's not about them. And that person-centered approach, which is you have to understand the distinction and the difference between the two. Theresa, how does this fit with your practice in terms of how do you guard against that? What's your safeguarding approach?
A really, really good point, particularly because the funding, you know, has outcomes, outputs, has all this language that they want to almost know what you're going to do before you've done it. And of course, you're working with people who are going to respond differently, who are going to come with different needs. I mean, more recently, what I've started to do is be very conscious and work with another partner. So I'm not the only person in the room. And I think that's just opened up a whole different perspective for me, because in the past, it would usually be me delivering. And when you're delivering, you know, I am an artist, so I want to sort of help people make their art and be creative. So, you know, there's lots of kind of demonstration, workshop type things going on. But I don't always get that time to sort of look at the dynamics within the room and read the room and do exactly what you were talking about, looking in order to understand people. When you take a step back and you do delivery with somebody else, so their main role is to deliver, and I'm the person there who's observing and taking note and seeing where a little intervention might be needed in order to help someone, it makes me much more aware of the safeguarding issues. And the safeguarding issues are about keeping the people in the space safe, but they're also about keeping the people who are delivering safe as well, and recognizing if they've just heard something traumatic and how it might trigger them. So you have those little short debriefing sessions afterwards with the person, and that's as much for my benefit as it is for theirs. And that's, I think, in terms of funding, I don't know the answer. It's really, really frustrating. I think it could be a combination of getting the language right. And I know as an academic, I'm having to learn that. It's a whole new language I'm having to learn, coming from a community arts background. And then sort of listening to Katie and listening to Catherine, you know, they have some of that language. So as a freelancer, it's almost like, you know, we need to develop that language and then understand what it is that we need to ask for in order to have support for ourselves.
We need to give Catherine, who dropped out for a moment and has rejoined us, a summary and a recap. And I think actually that's quite good. You're going to have to help me with this in terms of what we've been discussing. I think we've arrived at the point where we were thinking about the practice in terms of, if this is so ubiquitous as an idea, if you like, pervasive trauma within society in different manifestations, how do we respond to this in a way which doesn't re-traumatize people by going over or under trained, and I would include myself in this, under-trained people trying to do good, but actually adding to, compounding issues that people may feel and have negative views about from their past. Just a phrase that Nell Noddings uses, which is, it's the difference about what we care about and what we care for. And it's, I care about the environment. Well, how do you care about the environment? Well, I watch David Attenborough programs on TV and I like the penguins. And then when you say, well, how do you care for the environment? You say, well, I've got a pot in the yard with some daffodils in it. And so you start to talk about things that are concrete, and that care, that language of care, which has been excluded from Western modern society because we're dominated by business and masculine forms of male forms of achievement, and kind of it's about getting things done, whereas the kind of more, I'm using probably social stereotypes here, the more feminine or female approach to care, nurturing, understanding, that kind of thing. This is more of is this a way of engaging with these experiences that people have in a way which brings a language which is outside or different to or contrasts with some of the more industrial, process focused kind of, and the funding organizations are often outcomes. What are your outcomes? There are no outcomes. We just want people to feel good about themselves and to feel better, and that doesn't get you a funding call, a successful funding call. Catherine, what's your experience? What's your research indicated to you about that kind of difference between expectations of what people want and what people can deliver?
How can you hear me? I'm now on my phone.
Very well
Okay,
indeed.
great. Yeah, some sort of localized issue here causing me trouble. So in terms of sort of outcomes and expectations, it did come up. So I interviewed about 20 artists, and this question about funding and expectations from funders did come up as a source of frustration in terms of relating to time, therefore not kind of like allowing enough time for that kind of pause and reflection around, what's going on here in terms of the relational kind of dynamics, what's happening, what do I need to attend to here, and that the kind of numbers game doesn't allow for the various different kinds of experiences that are happening, and it also doesn't allow for different like definitions of quality work, and also like what does success mean in this situation. Well, actually, for example, in this situation, success means that this person came twice. That's actually out of 8 sessions. That's amazing. They came twice. That they even came at all was a really difficult step for them to take. So we kind of live in a culture that just emphasizes productivity and progression. We don't really value kind of stillness and reflection. Because it doesn't equate to kind of everything comes back to value, how much it costs, and so on, which obviously has its place, but then just overshadows the quieter, kind of less tangible work that is happening, the relational dynamics. So I really wanted to kind of emphasize how expert the artists are that I spoke to. So I might have been researching about trauma-informed community arts practice, but really I learned from the artists that I interviewed. They're already doing it, the experienced ones. They've learned on the job pretty much, or they've sought out their own training opportunities. They've done their own education. It hasn't come from the sector. And there's a kind of pervasive lack of professionalization of the sector. There's a lack of understanding of the expertise that that community artists or social practice artists employ in how they work with not only their kind of participants or the communities that they're working with, but how they work across all the different partners, how they handle this the kind of power dynamics that are happening. On the one hand, the artist maybe does have quite a lot of power in terms of they know what's going on. They may be the kind of protagonist, the lead in what's going on. But on the other hand, their hands are tied by perhaps kind of agendas that are happening at a kind of a commissioner's level or a funder's level or so on. I don't know if I answered the question really, but yeah, what I did see was there's various things that limits the ability for a community artist to be trauma informed, and one of those is the expectation of what success looks like in relation to funding.
I want to move to a kind of if you like, we've looked at the kind of the details of this, but I want to know what the joy is in this and what you gain and why we do this in terms of that emotional social sensitivity that we have to other people's needs. What's the benefit of that, and what have you seen in your practice that really, you know, if we're informing people and saying this should be part of the curriculum, this should be the way that you know, socially informed artists engage with people, participatory models, you know, what's the joy? What have you found from your own practice that keeps you moving forward and going? You know those moments where you somebody smiles at you and says, "Oh, I enjoyed that," and you kind of go, "That made it worth it." There are always those moments for me, which are those intangible, small moments which you can never put on a evaluation report, or you find very difficult to put on an evaluation report, but on a personal level, it makes all the difference. Katie, let's go to you first. What do you look for and what do you enjoy in those moments?
I'm thinking, I guess for me, the joy is when I can step out of that situation. So when I can step out of a workshop or a project or whatever, and that group of people that I've worked with still want to meet. They've got the motivation to meet up, to find a space, to want to do stuff together. So it's, you know, and it doesn't necessarily still have to be about the art, although it generally is. But it's just that process has enabled really deep, nurturing connections. You know, it's a space where people have felt seen, they've felt heard, they felt truly cared for, and they've cared for each other. You know, I think the artist's role is facilitating that, but we don't own it. And when we can step away and, you know, that particular group or those participants can you know, take ownership of that, or even if they're not taking ownership of it, you know, within a group, it's impacting on their interactions with other people, you know, the way that they might change the way they interact with their family or their support worker or, you know, whoever it is. I think it's just when you see those moments of care, that's the joy for me. So it's more about when I can step away, not about kind of when I'm in it.
Theresa, how about you?
I think Katie's right. It's kind of what people do afterwards as well. I mean, sometimes you do get just little comments in the room, like, you know, it can be something like somebody could say, "God, I don't know where the time's gone. I sort of come in and then the next thing it's 12 o'clock and then I go home and I'm knackered." And that's kind of a positive thing because they've completely lost themselves and immersed themselves in that experience. But then sometimes it's hearing those comments that come secondhand. You know, during Refugee Week, we had an amazing event where lots of different people came together and exhibited and performed. And there was a lovely remark from one person who said that the group that came up on the minibus were very quiet, you know, that they were getting ready to perform. But then when they left and went back on the minibus, they were all singing together, you know, and these were people that didn't really know each other that well. They came together underneath an umbrella and used to meet once a week. And that's great. That's what it's about, because I have, you know, the privilege to be able to create spaces where people can come together and do things. And then they kind of take it and run with it and do with it what they want. Sometimes you see it and sometimes you don't. So it is about it's important to let go, that's really important. And then also I think important to acknowledge the power that you have in terms of being able to bring these different things together, because you're there in that particular position at the time.
A word comes to mind, and Catherine, I wonder if this was borne out in the interviews that you did, is that this isn't about trauma. This is about healing. And how do we know that healing, I mean, from the descriptions that Katie and Theresa have just given, how do we know that healing is taking place? That's kind of the priority or our aim. How does that fit with the conversations you had, Catherine?
Yeah, absolutely. It is about kind of contributing to someone's either healing or recovery or like rebuilding of their lives, however kind of small a part that might play. And yeah, I mean, with my interviews, I was sort of focusing on the difficulties and the challenges. So it was less about like the benefits of working with art, because I just, there was quite a lot of reports out there and research already. So I just took that, I said, I'm working on this premise that art does A, B, C, D already, but absolutely. I mean, from my own experience of working on community arts projects, I totally agree with Theresa and Katie in terms of you're kind of trying, success feels like creating another community within that space that then, where it kind of goes off and then does its own things. So I get a real joy from seeing what some of the women that I've worked with in the past, seeing what they're up to now. And that's just fantastic. And knowing that, if I can provide a space where someone feels properly welcomed, seen and heard, and then they've got an opportunity to kind of use art for themselves. So whether in my practice it's kind of collage or printmaking or what have you. So it's kind of comes back to that cultural democracy, doesn't it?
Kind of last, if you like, set of questions or thoughts is, what are we going to do with this? How are we going to roll this out? How do we? I mean, it's fascinating, Katie. I work with criminal justice settings or domestic violence. It's kind of as a trying to find the right word. A tool's the wrong word, but as an approach towards recognition of trauma and healing of that trauma. This has wide applicability. The artistic, creative practice, that immersive approach of reflection that comes through that practice, and then bonding with other people who are in that similar experience. Okay, what do we do with this now? How do we ensure that this is something which becomes, part of our standard approach?
I don't mind answering that. I was starting to answer it. I guess it was Catherine that planted the seed with me. And that goes back to Artists Union England, the trade union that was set up over 10 years ago now, I think. And something that came out of that more recently was the Good Practice Charter, which is like it's a reference, it's a sort of set of values of how artists value themselves and how organizations should value themselves, and how it hasn't really looked at the work that Catherine started around how freelancers work in this area, and what people can be doing in order to either protect themselves, look after themselves. And it's a response to also, I guess, a lot of things out there which talk about, you, Rob, you touched on it, how sometimes our own mental health and well-being is put down to the individual. It's very individualized rather than actually it's a collective thing, because we're all experiencing this. So I think Catherine started the ball rolling already by talking to artists about it and getting artists to think about it. And then that sort of flagged it up with me. So I look out for anything that's looking at that particular area, such as the GLAM conference that happened recently. And the GLAM conference is Gallery Learning, Archives and Museums. And that was set up a couple of years ago from people who work in that area during COVID were finding that they needed some kind of support. So, I'd be looking to speak to other trade union members in Artists Union England. I've done casework as a union member, and I was thinking of all those visual artists that haven't made it, who've gone into this area of work and then just couldn't cope with the stress and couldn't cope with the burnout and weren't able to manage all of the feelings that it brought up for them. So there's still a lot of work I think we as practitioners and freelancers have to do. And then there's lots of good practice out there that arts organisations are doing that they can share. So it's looking at the positives, I think, as well as thinking, look, we do need to improve the way people are treated and what we do.
Katie, how about you? Any thoughts on what we do follow on with this?
I guess my thoughts are a bit more cynical, I think. I think having the experience of working both as a support worker, because I thought, if I'm going to work in these, really challenging settings, then I need to see it from both sides. So I need to have the experience of the support work and also, the experience of being in the artist in those settings. And what I discovered was, I worked for quite a few organisations that were trauma informed, and these are not arts organisations, these are support services. But trauma informed is a real buzzword. So, it's really great to describe your organisation as trauma informed, because then you can draw down more funding. But what that means in practice, I didn't see a lot of trauma informed practice in those settings. I saw some really, really poor practice, some oppressive practice, some practice. I think Catherine was telling me about there's research out there that says that quite often the abuse that people have experienced that kind of is the reason for them seeking support from organisations can quite often be replicated within those organisations. And that's definitely what I've seen. I've experienced that firsthand as an artist. So I think, in terms of what we do as the arts sector, we need to be really robust. If we're saying that we're trauma-informed artists, then it's not an afternoon's training. It's really doing the work for ourselves. So knowing what it means to be emotionally regulated, because that's really important. Understanding how our own trauma might have impacted us. So it's about, responsibility and accountability, and that, like I say, that robustness, so that we're not just, playing the game of tagging trauma informed on as a buzzword. We've got to be genuinely trauma informed. And I think, to be fair, trauma informed practice, we're a long way off across all sectors. I think it's a utopian idea that is many, many, many years away. But if we're responsible and accountable as a sector, we can, do some really good stuff. So that's kind of a cynical answer and a hopeful answer rolled into one.
Catherine, can you beat that?
No, it's brilliant. There is hope there, isn't there? This, trauma informed is just one term. There's also kind of trauma sensitive, trauma aware. There's looking into kind of the effect of shame. So understanding how shame affects people's behaviour. So this is all kind of hopeful movements towards kind of more compassionate, people-centered, strength-based approaches to work, where we're more attuned to power dynamics and what the potential pitfalls are of not being attuned to potential procedures or ways of working that might take away someone's feeling of being in control. So relating to what Katie was saying about the reason why this work is important is because research shows that people's trauma is compounded, made worse by how they're then supported. If that support echoes kind of dynamics of control, coercion, or abuse, then that just makes it all much, much worse. So that is, so I just got kind of hints of this in my own work, learning from the women that I work with about, which, you know, they kind of gently and generously kind of shared with me, you know, actually, I can't be recorded on audio because last time someone, you know, did this is what happened, and things like that. And that, you know, happening 10 years ago or longer, is these little kind of hints through the work that made me realize, well, there's a lot here to understand. Plus I was really worried about them. Well, where's my potential to harm through my ignorance? Yeah, so keep having the conversations. Please come and, you know, get in touch if it speaks to you. As Theresa said, as Katie said, there's loads of good practice out there already. It's not necessarily called trauma informed. It's just kind of thoughtful, caring, mindful, compassionate, ethical, transparent, consensual practice. So yeah, which is great.
Wonderful. Well, I've learnt a lot, and I feel better informed and less insecure, which is always a good way to end a podcast. So it's thank you very much. So what I'll do is I'll put the links to each of you in the description for the podcast. It will be posted onto the ArtWorks Alliance website, which is artworksalliance.uk. You can find us on social media platforms. We're on X, Blue Sky, Threads. I think we're on Instagram, those kind of things. And we'll let everybody know about this because I think it's an excellent conversation, and one that the members of our network, we are a voluntary network funded through our members. So please do come and join us if you hear this podcast, and contribute to the discussion and share your thoughts within the network as well. So until next time, to Catherine, Theresa and Katie, I just want to say thank you very much. That was a really good conversation. Thank you. You've been listening to the ArtWorks Alliance podcast. Find out more at artworksalliance.uk.